When I first got my mission call and was ready to head off to Puerto Rico, it was time to leave Los Angeles and drive to Provo to start my time at the MTC. And I was scared to death. I didn't want to admit that. I'd always been pretty independent and thought I could handle things. And yet it was getting real. And it was getting real quick. We get in the car, my mom and dad and I, and we start heading off. And we spend the last night before hitting the MTC in Las Vegas, about halfway there. And again, I wake up that morning just freaking out like it's happening. I'm leaving my family. I'm going on my mission. I don't know what I'm doing. And before we left town, I said, Mom, Dad, can we go to the temple? There's one here in Vegas. Can we go? And they're like, oh, sure. Yeah, great. One last time to be able to go before you head out in the field. Wonderful. We went, and all of my fears evaporated. As I'm sitting there in the Lord's house, feeling that the Lord would be with me on my mission, I knew I could handle this. And that faith displaced all that fear for a couple of miles once we left the temple. And we're going through the desert, and I'm starting to freak out again. I'm starting to get all that fear of, will I be able to do this? Will I be able to learn Spanish well enough? Will I be able to handle 2 years on my own away from home? Can I do this? And a couple hours later, as we're driving through St. George, Utah, I see the temple, and I think, Mom, Dad, can we go to the temple? And they were like, huh? We were just in the temple this morning in Vegas. I'm like, I know, I could use a recharge. And they were like, oh, sure, why not? So we did another session there. And again, faith pushed out fear. And I knew all would be well. Until I left the temple and got back on the road. And then I started freaking out again. Now, no, we didn't have time to go through Manti and then do another one in Provo. And there were fewer temples back then anyway. But the difference between feeling faith in the Lord's house and feeling fear as my mission loomed could not be more stark for me. And honestly, if there's one thing that I think keeps us from opening our mouths and sharing the gospel, whether full-time missionary or full-time member, it's fear. And that seems to be a common trait, not just for modern day missionaries, but for the early saints as well. In section 30, you meet 3 brothers that all have the same problem. And the problem is fear. Look at verse 1 of section 30. To David Whitmer, you have feared man and have not relied on me for strength as you ought. Or verse 35, to Peter Jr., fear not, but give heed unto the words and advice of your brother. Or verse 11, to John, not fearing what man can do, for I am with you. Brother by brother by brother, it's fear and more fear. And I don't think it's just a Whitmer trait. It's a human challenge. And what are we fearing? Go back and let's interrogate these 3 brothers and try to help us overcome our own fear. Back to the first example, section 30, verse 1. What was David fearing? Man. And to the point that the next line, you have not relied on me for strength. This whole time, have you thought it was man against man? If that's the case, then you have every reason to fear because you're no better than they are. You're no stronger on your own. And so if it's arm of flesh versus arm of flesh, then yes, you have every reason to tremble. But if you know that I am with you, if you rely on me for divine strength, my strength is here for the asking. So come unto me. The arm of God will always be able to arm wrestle the arm of man. So if I am with you, what do you have to fear? He even says this in verse 2, still to David. Your mind has been on the things of the earth more than on the things of me, your maker. And maybe that's a source of fear as well. What do I stand to lose if I go out on this mission? What did I stand to gain if I stay? If I keep my mouth shut, do I get to hold on to my cultural capital? If I open it and people reject the message, what will I lose there? Where's my mind? Is it too much on temporal things? And are temporal losses outweighing spiritual gains? That kind of fear will scare us off from church service as well. To the next brother, Peter Whitmer Jr., again, it's fear not, but give heed unto the words and advice of your brother. Now, David needed vertical trust. Trust me, I'm with you. Quit fearing men. What's interesting here, though, is If David needed vertical trust, Peter Jr. needs more horizontal trust. We sometimes struggle in both directions. In this one, heed the words and advice of your brother. Are you afraid of doing that because he's a mere mortal? It's one thing to fear because God isn't with you when you know he could be. But fearing others in terms of their own fallibility, that seems like a pretty well-grounded fear, actually. And yet, part of developing faith is also developing trust in one another. Mere mortals, fellow human beings, a mission companion, a spouse, someone that we're serving with in a church calling. And will we have enough faith to overcome the fear that they're as fallible as we are? Can I really trust a local leader? The answer is try. Exhibit faith. Overcome fear. And one other piece of advice that the Lord gives to Peter Jr. is in verse 6. And be you afflicted in all his afflictions. I love that phrase because it reminds me of the atonement. Jesus Christ was willing to be afflicted in all of our afflictions. That's substitutionary atonement. And what did Jesus gain in Gethsemane? Perfect empathy. He was afflicted in our afflictions. He joined us in our suffering and sorrow. And in some ways, if Peter were to do that with his brothers, nothing breeds familiarity quite like shared suffering. And nothing breeds trust quite like familiarity. And nothing breeds trust quite like empathy. If we can come to know one another and suffer with each other and allow their afflictions to become our afflictions, the human connection that that forges will bring faith and overcome fear. I can trust you. You're doing the best you can, and I am too. And then that last fearful brother, John, what did we already see in verse 11? Not fearing what man can do, for I am with you. This is similar to what David was told. We're back to vertical trust now. I am here. No wonder he can say in verse 11, you shall ever open your mouth in my cause. If I'm here inspiring you, then what's slowing you down? What's stopping you? In fact, what will ever get you to cease if you're in my service? In fact, back to my own mission, I did have one fear that I didn't mention to anyone, but it was the fear of missionary service someday growing old. Just kind of outgrowing it or getting bored with it, tired of it. Like I'm ready to move on to other things. Football had always been that way. I loved the sport. By the end of the season, I was ready to move on to other things. And I wondered, will missionary work get old? Well, here I am 30 years later, still sharing the gospel. This is the best thing I can do, as close to being a missionary as possible. It has not grown old. Part of what makes it forever new is, number one, the feeling that God is with me is such a renewing experience every time. Feeling the Spirit never grows old. And the other part is, if I am ever opening my mouth in his cause, as was said in that verse, it'll never get old because the open mouth always meets a new open ear. And as I meet individuals and hear their stories and allow their afflictions to become my afflictions and see them through the lens of God, it's forever new. Because my conversation partner is always different. It's got to be an intense weight on the shoulders of apostles and prophets who retire at their funeral, that they never cease to open their mouth in God's cause. But it's because God has helped eliminate their fear. Whatever those fears might be, if we can trust God and exercise our faith in him, then whatever fears are keeping us from sharing the gospel, those fears will be laid to rest as well.